I'm going to introduce the panel and say a little bit about them and a little bit about the format. They're going to give a 5-minute presentation each, and then that will leave lots of time for questions, comments, debate, discussion involving the audience and the panel. That's the way it works. I'll introduce them in the order they're going to speak. So first to speak will be James Hartfield. And James is a political historian who writes and lectures on a range of topics, from creative industries to the history of the British Empire. And he's the author of several books, including The European Union and the End of Politics and Unpatriotic History of the Second World War. The next speaker is on the other side here, and that's Jeremy Hutchinson, and he's an artist based in London. He works with situational performance, rehearsing ways to disrupt the tyranny of common sense. He's exhibited at the ICA, V&A, Modern Art Oxford, and IVA Biennial, and recently returned from a residency at Raw Material Company in Dakar. And next to Jeremy is Stefano Raboli Pansera, and he is an architect, architectural theorist, urbanist and curator. And in 2013, he co-curated the Angola Pavilion at the 55th International Art Exhibition in Venice at the Biennale, which won the Golden Lion for Best National Participation. And next to me on my right is Vicky Richardson, who is a writer, curator and consultant, and she's a former director of architecture, design and fashion at the British Council, where she was responsible for commissioning the British Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennial. So that's our speakers. I must give apologies for Judith Knight. Judith can't be here this evening, but we're very sorry that she's not here. But there's some very good news, because Judith's daughter actually went into labour this morning. So she'd been part of our panel, but she contacted Wendy to say this had happened, and she was in the Whittington Hospital. And subsequently, we've learned that Judith's daughter gave birth to a 9-pound baby boy. So I'm sure we'll send her our congratulations. So with that very happy news, let's go to James to start us off.
Okay. Thank you, Pauline, and Wendy, and all the people that worked to make this session and this series really interesting set of discussions. We started with what Brexit would mean for the arts, and I feel bad now because I've got caveats that are so big they might overawe the issue slightly. Because first off, I think we ought to know that it's relatively likely now that there won't be a Brexit. I think that's, and I don't say that with any joy or excitement, or I think it's quite a problematic thing. But I think it's relatively clear that the kind of opportunistic way that the Conservative Party embraced that going into the election has somewhat been exposed by this rather mediocre outcome of the election. And we've got a very weird situation right now, which is that we have the two major parties are both formally committed to leaving the European Union, but neither of them are substantially committed. I mean to say that the MPs really don't want it. And I don't know where that's going to go. I suspect that's going to lead to a lot of indecision for a long time to come. So I think that's something we need to know, and that is going to be a question and a challenge for people in Britain who are interested in democracy for certainly a few years. And then the other thing I want to say is that's on the politics side, but on the art side, I feel bad that I want to say that there really isn't a thing called the arts. You know, it's always worth saying that there's not a kind of a subject called the arts which has a point of view or a particular outcome in mind. There are great, millions of different activities, and most of them not really anything to do with politics. I mean, there are artists, I think we're going to hear from some of them, but who are specifically interested in political questions. But most art, of course, is, art can be about any number of things. And the question of what is art or what future for the arts is always a kind of insane question, because it's a bit like defining freedom. The minute you define it, you're closing off what it is. And in the same way, you know, we just don't know what will happen or what artists will do. So those are, you know, I don't think there is the arts which will have a view on Brexit or a response. So that, I think that's an important caveat. You know, most art is about, well, it can be about, you know, line or chord or declension, or it could be about who knows what. I suppose those things that really are attentive to this question, which is, as it were, in front of us, which I guess is something like who we are, kind of national identity question, have been a bit under-responsive. You know, that we don't see so many State of the Nation novels. I mean, the last one I read was Lionel Asbo by Martin Amis, which everybody hated, which amazed me because it seemed so in keeping with what so many people were saying to me about how ugly working class people were and how despicable they were, that I thought they would all love it. But I guess that they saw themselves in the mirror of Martin Amis's mean-spirited view and thought, well, let's not put our hands up to that one. You know, Jez Butterworth, I suppose, did a good... But State of the Nation, I don't think it's there. You know, who do you see talking about it? I suppose the point that most people will go to is Grayson Perry. Grayson Perry, I think, is attractive for the fact that he has addressed, you know, this is a new thing, I'm going to address it. But I feel a bit like, you know, when people make films about the miners' strike, you've always got to be wearing a dress for some reason to be excited about the miners' strike. You've got to be some kind of cross-dresser or gay or something like that. And, you know, in years to come, I feel that I'm going to have to explain to students that actually the gay community was not the backbone of the miners' strike. This is to do with a particular desire to how do you address this thing. And that's a bit, you know, Grayson, I don't mind that he wears a dress. I love that he wears a dress. But it adds layers of, his persona adds layers of ironic distance, which I think is core, really, to the way he is interested in the question of the state of the nation. But he's interested in it very much with his tongue in his cheek. You know, that that's what the glaze is doing on those pots, is settling around the rather scrappy and cartoonish. There's a kind of feeble oxymoron going on in Perry's work, which I don't think is bad, but it's not that brilliant either. Anyway, so, what are the different responses? Before I came here this morning, I was sorry to say, a funeral for Nassim Khan. Nassim Khan died about 10 days ago. And Nassim was a great person who I knew through family friends. And she's kind of responsible for the general tenor of what we might call diversity arts, which I think has probably been the single most successful projection of the arts as a kind of social project in recent times. She wrote in 1976, I think it was, a report called The Arts That We Ignore, talking about minority arts, or as she joked at the time, I seem to remember, the black arts. Was the project was the black arts, and people would always say, with the black arts, are you sure? And she quite liked the irony of it. Sorry, Nassim, I think generally speaking, the kind of diversity culture is a slightly bullshittical kind of presentation of what Britain is. And you see it in government reports and things that when we say who we are, we often say, you know, multicultural Britain, which I think is kind of not true. As I was walking here, I walked past the London Metropolitan University. It was quite strange because they advertise you come to the University of the London Metropolitan University, and all the students that are depicted on the facades are black. All the students. There was every single one. There's about 10 different people doing studentish things. which people in education know this. You know, when you buy the prospectus, when you get the prospectus, there's always people of minorities on the cover. But people of minorities aren't particularly overrepresented in universities. That's simply not true. Most people in Britain are white. They're very, very white. According to the census, 85% of Britain is white. In Scotland and Northern Ireland, it's even whiter. I mean, it's not as white as Europe, but it's a very white country. And yet we choose to present ourselves as a kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic kind of a thing. And you think, well, why are we doing that? You know, what is that about? Why are we, you know, this is our national identity, so why are we so concerned to kind of disguise it and present it as something else? I know people hate it, but I have a certain sympathy with those people who complain about cultural appropriation. Because there is a thing that's going on where people of colour are used as a kind of a badge of liberal acceptability and are presented as, you know, pushed forward as if to say, you know, you are our representatives, in a sense which is literally not true. You know, the London Metropolitan University's executive staff aren't black. Most of their students aren't black either, but they choose to present themselves in that way. And I think that, you know, Diversity Britain is unconvincing. I think broadly it's unconvincing. And I think perhaps in a way that was why people did vote Brexit, is because they didn't really see themselves recognised in that. And there's something unspoken that they did feel was expressed in the Brexit vote. So I think that lastly, the last thing I want to say, am I out of time? The last thing I want to say is that there is something about artists as well. You know, I've said that artists aren't any one thing or any other thing, but I think there is something about them as a group, let's say. I'm talking trend now, not overwhelmingly, not like a law of nature, but artists are supposed to be a bit different from everybody else. And naturally, I think, take a kind of a critical distance upon the world and cut themselves off slightly from the hoi polloi. Well, you would have to, wouldn't you? Because the whole point is to make it new and make it different and to do something dramatically unheard of or at least a step beyond. And I think that means that as a group, they're not very sympathetic to democracy as a whole. You know, they don't really love the people. And if they did, that would be weird and creepy, I suspect. You know, who did celebratory art in recent times? You know, when did anybody celebrate anything? I'm thinking, you know, it's always been, it's very hard to hit the celebratory note. And we're all kind of disgusted by it when it happens. You know, there's something about, I think Peter Nyman, probably the last musician that really caught that sensation. But even then it was creepy and weird, all that ba 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 ba. And so that I think there's something, not necessarily so, but in trend, hostile to democracy in arts. And that sounds like I'm against the arts. I'm not. I love the arts, whatever they are. But you know, we shouldn't really expect the arts to be a kind of custodian of national sentiment. So I guess, in conclusion, I think the arts that are really going to do well out of the Brexit shenanigans are probably satire. I think it's going to be quite a satire boom. People are going to be making fun endlessly about the inadequate performance of our political leaders. I think that's likely to happen. I think the rest will be rather tongue-in-cheek or ironic reflection. Expect a lot of that. And that's good, you know. That's where we are. We're in an ironic, self-reflective, self-deflating moment where a great leap forward has turned into a kind of massive stagger backwards, and people probably do need a bit of a laugh at these times.
Thanks, James. That's great. Thank you.
What is a cat? A cat is everything it is not. A cat is not a dog. It is not a bus, not a tree, and not a parrot. So what is a cat? Well, it's furry, but not quite like a dog. It makes a purring sound, but not at all like a Rolls-Royce. The real definition of a cat or anything else occurs at the place where it meets what it isn't, at the point where the inside collides with the outside. This is called the constituent outside. So if we want to understand something, if we want to understand ourselves, then we have to position ourselves in relation to something that we are not. And I think what this means for our nation as we contemplate the fallout of Brexit is that we need to learn how to collide, the inside with the outside. We need to learn how to argue. Because in this country, we don't know how to do this. At least in my family, we don't. Not at the dinner table, not on holiday, and definitely not at Christmas. And I don't think artists are much better. Arguments cause us to shut down, defriend one another, or recoil to our bedrooms. And this is the effect of our cultural conditioning, because as a nation, we've spent centuries protecting ourselves from arguing. The world knows us. We are globally renowned for our specific forms of language and behavior that regulate conversation, that guarantee a regime of politeness will prevail through any possible social encounter, in order that we can just all get along. And so as long as we all just get along, we'll never know who we really are, as individuals and as a nation, because there will be no collision. For me, perhaps the clearest learning from the Brexit referendum was the failure of British social relations, a failure for the inside to meet the outside on a geographical and on a personal level, a kind of failure that was manifest in the surprise that metropolitan Remainers like me experienced as we rubbed our bleary eyes, faced with a moment of collective disbelief. Britain on that morning seemed unrecognizable to us, and that's because I think we had failed to collide properly with that which we were not. I don't know what Brexit will mean for Britain. I don't know what it will mean for the arts, and I'm not going to stand here and fight for Britain remaining in the EU, because that ship has sailed, maybe. But what I do know is that Brexit has done something really important, and that is to reveal the catastrophic lack of politics in this country. And by politics, I don't mean the stuff that happens in political institutions or the stuff that sells newspapers. I mean the politics that takes place among the polis, that is woven into the folds of our social fabric, the politics that could take place at the dinner table, but most likely doesn't. So what am I proposing? That we bypass our cultural conditioning and simply forego centuries of British conflict aversion? No. I'm proposing that we imagine ways that art can help to point us in a more argumentative, more political direction, and that we support the kind of art practice that can help investigate and even celebrate the division caused by Brexit. The kind of art practice I'm talking about is manifold, but one kind is like this. It operates as a sort of rehearsal space where new forms of social relations can develop. Dominant social hierarchies can be rewired. Disconnected communities can be brought together in collision to produce new and possibly antagonistic social encounters. So I'm precisely not talking about art that builds communities, but perhaps the opposite. Art that builds conflict, that performs for its audience the very fact that it's okay and maybe even fun to argue. Art that invites the audience into this argumentative process. At best, I think the most valuable thing art can do is to show us that we can't ever truly understand one another. Instead, at its most valuable, art can reveal the way we perceive the world is radically different from the way our neighbor does. And hopefully, we can learn to respect that difference. So how do we do this? I have a few ideas, and it's about taking a look at the field in which art practice takes place. First, I think we need to support the production of art that is far noisier, art that generates noise in its audience as they are forced to articulate their responses. We need art critics to judge the success of the work by the amount of noise that it generates, by the problems it causes, not the empathy it seems to inspire. We need to encourage artists to be risky and rude. We need art schools to steer artists away from making impassioned arguments on safe subjects, and to make it fashionable for young artists to challenge leftist humanitarian assumptions just as much as they disassemble right-wing capitalist hegemony. We need to develop a tendency within broad public audiences to recognize that the value of artwork that seriously challenges their own morality. We need curators to identify and dissect uncharted areas of discord lurking within our so-called common sense, and to boldly program exhibitions that open up the real disharmony that exists in our social realm. We need the Arts Council to revise their requirements so that funding doesn't simply support community engagement, but also community dispute. So whatever happens to the arts after Brexit, I'd like to propose that we use it as an opportunity to revise the instrumentalization of artists to smooth over our socio-cultural cracks, to give artists the critical and institutional support to really make trouble, to cause collisions, and to show Britain that it's okay to argue, that arguments are fundamental to our sense of meaning, and that Christmas dinner will still go on.
Thank you. Well, I come from a background which is very difficult to identify and to spot into a specific trajectory, because I'm Italian, and I had the honor and the privilege to study here in London, which was an extraordinary experience of contact, promiscuity, inspiration, with some people from a different path. And this is like some extraordinary assets that a few cities in the world can give, more than London, or as much as London. And I developed my research in between the architectural practice and the curatorial one. And this gave me like the opportunity to test some of the possibilities of agency and production, cultural production, in different areas, in different territories, in Africa as well, in the south of Europe, in the Mediterranean. And I frankly don't think that the issue of the Brexit is so bad as sometimes is described. In a way, I am probably more cynical about it, because I don't think that many things are going to change. In a way, what you described before about the resistance and the capability of subverting the rules of the market remain one of the biggest challenges for artists and for cultural production. And from the political point of view, there is always the same type of effort and mission. How do we produce artworks or forms of art that engage and stimulate participation beyond the rhetoric of democratic art? How do we start producing for communities and not for wealthy collectors that accumulate and buy artworks as a commodity? I mean, these problems are not touched in a way by Brexit. This is like a dynamic that just touches the surface of the problem, but the real issue is still there. What, on the contrary, Brexit touched upon is a wonderful, lively debate that we just dream of in the south of Europe. We still are in a very sleepy type of context and atmosphere. So in a way, the effect of Brexit is quite positive, because it really triggered the attention, the curiosity, and the active participation of people. I recently joined a commercial gallery because my mission of creating my own language, my own curatorial path, and simply failed, because I realized that it is impossible to produce new contents, meaningful contents, outside the realm of the market. And I tried in any possible way. Vicky knows about all my attempts with the British Council, with the Italian Council, and so in a way I was very keen to participate to this debate tonight, to know other points of view, and to really see what are the possible clues that we have in order to still produce new meanings and new actions.
Yeah, tricky going last, because everyone said really interesting things that I that I'd like to mention, but I'm just going to stick to what I was going to say. I left my job at the British Council around about the same time as the referendum last year, and it sort of became a bit of a kind of analogy for me, in the sense of, just as I was breaking free from the institution and from the constraints of working for a government quango and this sort of being part of that establishment, then this sort of this dramatic moment in politics and history happened, and it's kind of it's certainly for me like a real line in the sand. And I was interested that James thinks Brexit's not going to happen, and others are cynical about the impact that it may have. I guess for me, I feel that things have already happened, and that in a way, things will never quite be the same again, and something has, a giant bath plug has been pulled out, and somehow we're in a different era now. And what that means for the arts is difficult to say specifically. But before talking about that, I wanted to just question this term, the arts, as you did, James, because I do think the arts exists, but I think it's very different from art. I think we have to. I think it's worth reflecting on what we mean when we say the arts, and I think it is a different thing from both art and individual artists and even collective artists. I think the arts has become a particular force. It's not quite a single institution or a single policy, but it certainly is a lobby, a group of people who. It certainly reflects a certain point of view, and I very much think that Brexit was a rejection of that kind of establishment and that kind of point of view. It really came home to me this morning, actually, because I went to the opening of the Serpentine Pavilion, which is the annual architectural commission of the Serpentine Gallery. It's now in its 17th year, so it was started in the year 2000 with Zaha Hadid's radical experimental structure. And this year, the architect is an African-born architect called Francis Kere, who was trained in Berlin and has been running a practice in Berlin since 2005, but is always seen as an architect from Burkina Faso, regardless of the fact that he's been running a very sophisticated European practice for quite a long time. And there were several speeches at the opening this morning. One of them in particular struck me in terms of this question of the arts. Justine Simons, who's the deputy mayor for culture, took over from Manira Mirza. She spoke, and she was the third speaker, and everybody who spoke started their speech by talking about the Grenfell Tower, Finsbury Park, the election. They prefaced their remarks by a sort of quick-fire sequence of references to recent current affairs, which I thought was quite bizarre, actually, because it wasn't simply a kind of compassionate reflection on Grenfell. It was a politicized, I think, reference to what's happened, and I thought that was interesting. But then Justine went on to say, at this moment we really have to ask, what is the role of culture in the arts? What are the arts for? And really, that question was a way of asserting that the arts, have this key role now in society as almost as a social force, as an economic force, but primarily at this particular time as a force for healing. And it really made me think, that the arts and the creative industries, the cultural industries, this sort of machine, whatever it is, this force is, you can kind of date it back, I guess, to the Blair government and to the moment where the arts and the creative industries actually became treated as a branch of industry, measured, managed, held to account, and so on, all of the things that we're familiar with now. And during that period, I think that the role attributed to the arts has changed and evolved. And at some moments, it's an economic role. It's a role of regeneration and export and reviving the economy. At other moments, it's been much more focused on health and well-being. And now, in this particular moment, the arts is about healing and about bringing us together and about making us reflect on what we have in common rather than our differences. So this was the very clear message that came across this morning from somebody who I guess Justine Simon must sort of, if anyone represents the arts, she at an official level, she probably does. And I must say I really reacted against that because it reminded me very much of being back at the British Council, where the role of the arts, is probably the most instrumental that it is anywhere, because it's really all about building trust with nations overseas and the UK. But I thought that it was also ironic because inside the Serpentine Pavilion is Grayson Perry's exhibition where, if anyone's seen it, you can look at his sketchbooks, which is quite interesting, and you can see his jottings where he makes, I think what he's best at is making these very acute observations of society. And I mean, I don't like his pots really, but if you look in his sketchbook, it's really interesting because he writes down, there are quotes like, art should heal, or, art should make us more aware of alternative sexuality, or art will improve the built environment, and so on. And there outside on the lawn at the Serpentine Pavilion is this pavilion by an African architect, which is being presented as a vehicle for bringing together a community. They're holding something called Radical Kitchen, where there'll be people cooking food, where the communities can gather, where we can come together and supposedly heal ourselves at this difficult time. And it just seemed to me that this is a world away, really, from what art is. And I think that, if we carry on not challenging this sort of perception of what art is, then I don't think Brexit is going to go away. I disagree with you that it's not going to happen, because I think that people have already rejected this, and part of what some of us have fought for throughout this period has been the idea that people can see through this. Art's not a new thing. Art is part of our humanity, and it's been around for a very long time, and we have to have, I think, particular confidence in this discussion of the arts in the judgment and the intelligence of the audience. And I think people can tell good art, and they don't need officials from the arts to tell them what's good or even what art is for. Thanks very much.
Yeah, some really interesting differences there. I was quite struck by these different ideas of what Brexit is, never mind what the arts is, and that as a sort of a political process or something that has to be negotiated at transnational level. It may be stalling, it may be faltering, but as a moment, I think when you talked about the plug's just being pulled out, that plug doesn't go in again so easily, and that things have happened. And so this meaning of what is Brexit is, what does it actually mean, is something that maybe could be something that people will be exploring. I don't know. But knowing, again, the other thing I thought that was interesting was this question of what do the arts do? And should they have a role? Why would they have a role? And the transfer of authority seems to be from the managers and the people who have been organising things to possibly the audience, to the public, and be interesting maybe to think about what that might bring into the mix as well. I don't know if anyone on the panel has anything they'd like to add or maybe ask each other before we go out to the audience. Any thoughts on this? Any questions before we go out? Not necessary? Should we ask? It's brewing. We'll give them a rest then and let them brew for a little bit and see if there's anyone out in the audience who'd like to put forward comments, thoughts, questions. The spotlight is on you. Yeah, it's brilliant. And I'll take quite a few to begin with, just to give them a rest, and then ask them to come back on anything that comes up. Okay. Yes, that lady there, and then you're next.
Vicky, very much resounded with me what you said in having gone through the 3 series of the democracy and the arts in Europe. There did seem to be on all the panels a tension between those who are part of the arts bureaucracy and the artist. You know, each time we've had, actually not this panel so much, but someone who seems to represent the arts bureaucracy. And where you're putting in the Blair time, I remember being the lottery accountant in the Arts Council when the lottery money came in, and that seemed to be a real sea change because we used to, the Arts Council used to have, not that much money and it parcelled it out very sparingly to arts institutions, and people literally mortgaged their houses to have a little bit of a grant from the Arts Council, and suddenly all this money flooded in, which then seemed to create this whole set of institutions and bureaucracies and new museums and a sort of mission in a way. So, Jeremy, I'd just be interested, is there a tension between those who are artists and their practice and this huge institution which seems to me potentially more like the civil service? The way they reacted to Brexit is much more like how the civil service has reacted to Brexit. And if you're a bureaucrat, how could you ever imagine the world not being run by bureaucrats? It seems to be absolutely sensible. So I just wondered if there is that tension between the actual art practitioners and the institutions.
So I really enjoyed the speeches, and unusually I agree with pretty much everything that everybody said, which probably means that maybe I didn't fully appreciate it. Jeremy, I really agree with what you were saying, or at least the sense of what you were saying, I think, about we learn through collision. And one of the things that struck me about Brexit was, maybe there's an opportunity to learn anew about what sovereignty means, because it directly posed the issue of sovereignty, both nationally and individual sovereignty exercised through democracy. I suppose I'm not sure whether art is the best vehicle, but that's not to say it shouldn't be a vehicle for exploring those kinds of collisions. But I imagine that from your standpoint, the use of art for kind of therapeutic purposes or the purposes of community healing is kind of an anathema to you.
I suppose it follows on from that, my question, in which case, can art... I also agree with Jeremy. I thought Jeremy's contribution was really interesting in these images used of collision and creating new forms of getting on with each other. So my question is, can art in the future encourage that collision and encourage the getting together through debate, argument, call it what you like, but having those tough, hard arguments? Can art create the means of communication and the frameworks to express all of those differences and bring us together, or and not in a healing way, but in a way of actually getting to some form of resolution in a majority view?
Anyone else want to? Yeah.
Hi, I just want to. Basically, loved everything that everyone said and here. And I just wanted to put in my little bit as an artist who's essentially a landscape, middle-class white landscape painter. But I still want, do you know what I mean? But I still want to be part of whatever affects everything for everyone. And as James kind of described this problem that artists slightly have of being slightly doing their own thing, their own way. But along with what you've just said, just wanting to be part of the big story and connected with it, being each artist able to be their own difficult personality, or if that makes sense, you know, if you're an emotional person and that's how you make art, that it still contributes to the big thing that maybe becomes whatever the arts means, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I thought that there was really interesting and useful contributions here, and I, you know, sort of, I suppose one of the things it kind of raises for me is the kind of situation of the arts. So, you know, what world are the arts in, and you know how the arts sort of engage with that world, and what that world expects of the arts. And I think one of the problems we've been facing over the last 15, 20 years is this creation of the idea of the arts as a kind of political, social entity, which then becomes incredibly burdened with and responsible for society. So it is sort of like very much the question is, well, what can the arts do for us? And I'm wondering about whether there's a possibility of pushing that kind of question away completely and just say, we're not even going to we're not even going to answer that question, or whether we've gone too far down the road of the arts world, you know, almost creating a, you know, like for example in the Creative Industries Federation and various other organisations, creating a kind of, you know, an entity that probably a lot of artists are outside of, but are represented to the public as representing the arts. And it is quite interesting when, like, you know, organising this event and telling people about it. I went to a meeting, or not a meeting, a social gathering of a bunch of Brexiteers last week. And when I was sort of telling them, oh, you must come along to our meeting, it's going to be really interesting. The arts, oh, for goodness sake, they're just, and it's like, you know, they're up their own arses. And it's a sort of, you know, I think there is that kind of separation. And is it something the arts should worry about? Or perhaps, in fact, that separation is something to maybe cultivate, or maybe sort of not worry about, because actually what artists should be doing is one thing, you know, as people in society, and what the arts are is, I think, you know, what James was saying at the beginning was, you know, interesting. Maybe we should just stop talking about the arts. Having said that, I think the question about argument that Jeremy raised, I think was really interesting, because it is like, where is the argument in society? But I suppose it comes back to, well, are the arts really responsible for creating that argument, or are they, you know, should we, you know, is that another question kind of thing?
Well, yeah, there are kind of dilemmas in all of this, I think. One of the things that Grayson Perry said about his show, or he wrote a piece where he kind of said that he preferred the days where hardly anyone went to art galleries. And you know, now this is a mass activity, and it is true since the millennium, probably, you know, where the kind of capital projects that have happened around the country, and the whole push towards accessibility and access in terms of in terms of cheaper tickets for various things. And it is true that it is much easier to go and see stuff, and there are some fantastic exhibitions around, and it is great to be able to go to things. But on the other hand, I also agree with the sentiment that this is this really what we kind of set out to create, you know, when we were asking for more. Another remark, I was at an event a couple of weeks ago where the sculptor Richard Wilson, who made that fantastic thing in Terminal 2, the slipstream, we were talking about art education and art schools, and how how they've really gone downhill, and they're sort of factories now. Central St Martin's Foundation course has 600 people on it, and he basically said we should close down the art schools. That would be the radical thing to do, and there's kind of, I've got some sympathy for that, but on the other hand, when you go to the degree show at Central St Martin's and you look at their amazing facilities and all these kind of young people hanging around, it's very exciting. It's a really exciting thing, and you kind of think, well, yeah, if I was 18, I'd want to be there too. So I think there are these kind of these dilemmas in this discussion. But just very quickly on Jeremy's point about learning politics again, I think is a really astute point. I very much agreed with again, because I've felt what's happened over the last year is that, and this kind of gives me hope, is that a lot of the people I hang around with in the sort of architecture, design world talk about politics the whole time now. You can't go to a sort of private view or an event without having a discussion about something political. And I think that's a really good thing, because, previously these worlds were kind of separate, whereas now I certainly sense that politics is way more upfront. And what I hope is that this may lead to architecture being able to be architecture again, rather than art and architecture pretending to be politics or being a vehicle for talking about politics. Let's just talk about politics, and why, perhaps then we can enjoy landscape painting again, or we can talk about materials and structure and enjoy the kind of, the technique of architecture, space, form, all of the things that actually people are rather embarrassed to talk about now, because you've got to be socially engaged.
Would anyone else like to come back? Jeremy, there's a few questions for you. Do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Sure.
In sort of reverse order. I love the provocation of shutting art schools. That really appeals. I guess the counter argument would be that I guess framing education now with the looming and quite inevitable, I think, future of technological unemployment, where I think it's by 2032 we're going to lose 49% of our jobs, which new jobs that are created will probably also be automated. I think we have to consider the role of our education really seriously today. One in 11 of our workers work in the cultural or creative industries, they're called, which is set to increase dramatically, I think, as jobs start to disappear. So that's just a sort of a response to Richard Wilson. But to come back to, thank you for your points and your responses. In terms of sort of blending the two in sort of terms of me as an artist, I can only speak for myself and my relationship with institutions such as the Arts Council, and also this idea of community healing and the kind of instrumentalization of art to produce something that is pseudo-utilitarian. For me, that is central to my practice, actually. So in some ways, it's kind of like if God didn't exist, you'd have to create one. If these institutions weren't there, I think artists such as myself would find a way, because actually they produce the conditions for practice by giving us something to push against. So the sort of absurdist form filling that goes on produces something that my kind of repressed, disobedient child is allowed to sort of revolt against. I did a commission, for example, to give you a concrete example. I did a commission in Bristol. I was asked to do some work for a cancer hospital, and you get a brief when you do public art commission. I've only done 2. And this one said, artwork to produce to help to produce a supportive cancer care environment. Which I was at the Slade, I did a master's there, and we didn't have a lesson on producing supportive cancer care environments. And there is quite a lot of research showing that if you put a Rothko on someone's wall, it will, could significantly, deplete their serotonin levels, and you could actually just really make matters worse. So then, the first way to produce a supportive cancer care environment is, I think, not to put any art in it. But for me, this became, the reason to make work. So then I produced work that hovered in between these kind of modes. Was it artwork, which is, in a sort of traditional sense, defined by dysfunctionality, or was it a design object by being functional? And so I made these objects which kind of like, depending on, they were wall-based sculptures, if you like, powder-coated steel things which you could use, and people sort of sometimes do use, because there was nowhere to put their cards and their books and whatever. So it was a kind of like, could be a useful object, but it could also be considered within the framework of like minimalist 20th century sculpture. So all that to say, I think actually some of these incursions of institutional kind of like requirements and like heal us with your art, I find them like really kind of brilliant in being kind of so dogmatic, and actually they're like a homework assignment, yeah, thanks.
Stefano, actually, just on that, what I seem to be picking up here, in a way, is that the Brexit effect may have had a much more kind of made much more of an impact on the institutions, like the Arts Council and the commissioning institutions. They're reeling from it, and I wonder if it's opened up some space for artists to. And audiences too, to actually sort of get in there and carve out a space for themselves, while their paymasters, in a way, are reeling from it, from the shock. It's just when you were talking about the commissioning bodies that kind of set the terms and set the agenda and set up all the categories, if they're not able to do that with such confidence, then it does allow artists and others to come in and set their own agenda. Just a thought. Stefano, do you have any? You were.
I think that rather than replying to your question directly concerning the Brexit, I think that I would like to engage with some of the observations concerning the nature of art, because one of the most famous and beautiful definition was given by Gilles Deleuze, who said that every creative act is an act of resistance. First of all, is an act of resistance against communication. And in a world where everyone wants to communicate at all costs, when we can communicate with Facebook, with Twitter, when everyone wants to say things, artists offer a point of resistance against communication, because they don't want to say anything. I mean, when if actually you judge a sculpture of Donald Judd, when you even sculpture a beautiful vase by Grayson Perry, there is much more than simply education about political or social issues. There is some sort of a heart of darkness that constitutes a resistance against communication. Second is that is a resistance, an act of resistance against the political forces. This becomes very interesting in relationship to what Vicky was mentioning before, that recently we have been accustomed to the idea that the cultural, so-called the cultural industry, the cultural production is the new industrial revolution. Labor is constantly reduced to new forms of accumulation. So there was a physical labor that is reduced by the form of accumulation of the capitalist. The labor changes, becomes intellectual labor, and the capitalists construct new forms of accumulation, which is actually the economy of finance. And now we see a third generation of labor, which is a creative labor. And we are seeing that symmetrically, capital is constructing new forms to reduce the idea of the creative labor to commodity. Art must introduce a layer of resistance to this type of gentrification of the culture that you are describing so well. And this, I think, is one of the missions that we need to address. If we look at the force of the Creative Act from this point of view, again, Brexit, not Brexit, it doesn't make so much difference. I mean, what is at stake here is much higher than this. I just would like to finish even one thing, that very often there is, from my point of view, an appropriate overlapping between the position of the Brexit and positions of racism or like intolerance. And I think that it is not personally so true. I know many people that are liberal that, of course, voted for the Brexit for reasons that are purely bureaucratic or economical, not really for anything that is due to racism or to intolerance. So again, I don't think that is legitimate or appropriate to, in a way, convey the discourse about art to the issues about Brexit. And some of the instances raised by this conversation show and stress the importance to really keep this idea of the Creative Act as an act of resistance.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I said I thought it wasn't likely to happen, but not in the sense of urbane reflection, but really to raise the alarm, because I think this is a real thing that's happening right now, is that the democratic decision, which, you know, was a small majority, but it was a majority, will be taken away from us if we don't hold the people that are doing this to account. And I think that's a real possibility, because we're in a peculiar position of political flux, which has got all these different factors to it. And you've noticed, I'm sure, the very febrile atmosphere since the election around the terrible disaster in the Tower Block, the way that people have fixed Theresa May in their headlights. All these things are changing the game. You know, I think the fact that, you know, it seemed very certain after the referendum that that was a vote, and you could see the way that the Labour Party responded by saying we must press ahead, no matter what the naysayers are, that it seemed like the consensus was going to push very swiftly in the direction of Brexit, but that had a soft underbelly. I think we have to notice that the people who are our representatives are only verbally committed to this project, and it's not in their instincts whatsoever. I mean, there's some, but most of the MPs in Parliament don't really believe in it. They've been elected on that platform, but they really don't believe in it. And I think that's a real problem. I think there's another thing is a parallel conversation we're having is about the desire of artists to be political, which I think is important and compelling and intriguing where it happens. And I have great sympathy with people that want to address political questions through their art. But I don't feel there's any sense in which you could say art must be political or must be this kind of political or that kind of political. Lots of art, great art, is thoroughly reactionary. Lots of great art is thoroughly apolitical, and you know, the net accumulation of inventive and brilliant acts in the arts, if we can, you know, talk of a canon, is itself what's revolutionary. It's the sense in which everything is constantly improved upon or turned over, and all those things add up to a sense of that there are possibilities, irrespective of what the particular intentions and goals and ambitions of the artists and the particular works that they're doing. I think that's quite important. I feel quite. I'm more concerned by I'm less concerned by the political exigencies of art. I'm more alarmed by the kind of aestheticization of politics. I think it's really intriguing that our spokesperson of the moment is Katy Perry. And you know, the person who seems to have her finger on the pulse, or Akala, or, lots of cultural commentators come into the fore. You can see them, impressive figures in their own right, maybe not Katy Perry, but she's okay. And you can see them thrust into the limelight of the people who resolve our questions, because our politicians aren't really doing it. And even the politicians are obliged to respond in a kind of an aesthetic way. Emily Maitlis to Theresa May, "Why aren't you crying?" And you're thinking, what a crazy thing to say to the Prime Minister. And then that she has to say, "I am crying." And we would say, show us. And you're thinking, no, surely the political realm is supposed to be the reason bit, that will provide the emotions, will stir up the feelings, and you can kind of sew it up and make some reason out of all these intense feelings. But no, they've got to be, and it reminds me of this, there's a story, I think it's Frank Gorshin told the story about working in a, he was in one of those kind of acting schools, where you do this kind of method acting, and somebody walked in and said, "The president's just been shot," and all the acting students start going, thinking it was an exercise, and they're all doing these, "Oh my God, the president," and he said, "No, the president's been shot," and it was an actual thing that happened. And you think the enormity of this is a real problem that we have to face about what to do about the disaster in this tower block. And instead we have Katy Perry and "Will you cry for us?" and all this. And I'm more alarmed, as it were, by the fact that we only have art to address what is a political problem. It's going to be, we need to put, I'm not, this isn't but get lost artists. This is, come on, politicians, you need to supply this, because otherwise it's all going to be emotion and expression and aesthetic here on in, and we won't have resolution and solution and a program, which I think is kind of what we need.
Is that sort of a step back? Because someone in their question did talk about the Blair years, and the early Blair years were very much about this, what you talked about, this re-imaging of Britain in the sort of self-image of people like Blair's imagination of how he would like to be seen and the sort of nation he would like to be leading, but also this kind of love affair with lovies. It was very, very marked at the beginning of the Blair era, which I guess was a kind of displacement of politics, and everything that had been political was kind of depoliticized and put into the creative. So industry became creative, and everything moved into that sphere. Do you think it's happening again, in the sense that we're defaulting back to, we've been asked to confront huge political questions, we're maybe not rising to the challenge or the test that has been set for us, and we're looking longingly at the emotional comfort blanket of the arts, maybe to save us from having to deal with this. That's very bleak. Can answer that. We can answer that later or think about it. There's a hand out there. I'll take some more questions from the floor. We'll take a few more. Okay.
Maybe in the absence of real actors on the stage, we go about trying to find substitutes. And working in a creative industry with TV, certainly we spend all our time when we're thinking about programmes, we spend half the time talking about who could, what talent, who could present this, who's a good name, and that's a, the commodification of the fronting or the presentation is always a key issue when you're discussing with the broadcasters what to make, and who's going to say what. I thought that the comments from Stefano also really rang true in terms of coming from a creative industry in relation to Brexit and the kind of programmes that are acceptable and the kind of programmes that are unacceptable in terms of different broadcasters and their agendas. So I'm working with a couple of people at the moment who've been on a show, working title Diverse Britain, where the assumption really from the get-go has been that Brexit was really all about an increase in hate and racism, and that was the key. That's the key characteristic of Brexit, and that was the starting point of the programme, and basically the whole programme is really kind of like coming towards that end. I haven't seen it, so I wouldn't want to say anything too conclusive, but most of the people that I've talked to about it, and I was invited to interview for it, have told me that. And it's in terms of the creative industries sort of being all part of this kind of instrumental approach to exploring questions of identity. Often those broadcasters are like their own little mini political parties. They've got this agenda, and it's not really about opening up and exploring. It's about sort of capturing something they want to say. And in that regard, I thought that the Grayson Perry thing on pots that he did recently, there was at least one merit in that, in which he really was asking people what should be put on those pots, which was thank God there was something sort of that was authentic there.
It'd be nice to believe that the taking away of the European Union requirements that come with funding for art created a space, basically, and to follow Pauline, the idea that the institutions are disoriented, and so therefore there is a certain space to be critical or to be experimental. And for my money, it would be really good if in the education sphere, if what counted as good wasn't basically an expression of a certain kind of politics, basically a sort of official politics, and if your work expresses that politics, then it's good, because it seems to me what an underlying trend has been to undermine the craft of art, to undermine the kind of the reflection at the level of technique and practice, and one would hope that in this space that's created, there's more opportunity to put resource, to put headspace into the practice of art in its own terms. I suppose that's what I would hope for. The pessimist in me sees that there's quite a lot of that in the reconstruction of a post-Brexit Britain, and accepting the point that actually what might be happening is a reconstruction of a European Britain, but that in that there's lots of opportunities to recreate that kind of instrumentalism. There's no sense in which instrumentalism might disappear. I also feel that if authority is undermined, that's not the same thing as saying that students and young people will come up with anything better. It seems to me that this kind of absence, if you like, of a questioning art, of a politics, is a more general issue, and that the kind of the recreation of something that I would be excited about, it must be in the hands of teachers as much as students. And anyway, it's problematic. It seems to me that if we say, oh, well, instrumental art is a problem, it doesn't kind of ring true with people, because it's obvious that you want to have a nice sculpture in the middle of your hospital, do you know what I mean? Or a nice picture on the wall, It's kind of, it's kind of obvious that the focus has become one of an instrumental social policy to close down the people and to be official and to empty everything out. But I don't think it's read in such a straightforward way out there in public. What's the problem with this instrumentalism?
I must admit, I take a different view of what has been revealed in the pulling of this bad plug, that Vicky's analogy, and what it means for Britain. The thing that's been revealed to me mostly, I think, is that Brexit has shown that amongst a huge swathe of British people, and particularly, if you like, middle-class people and artists in particular, metropolitan elite, if you like, where they're mostly concentrated, is how deep their hatred of ordinary British people is. It's just like uncharacteristic. I mean, we've known it's there. Anybody who knows anything about history will know how, you know, the Victorians talked about working people in their rookeries. And I suppose, you know, to some extent, Grenfell reflects something of the existence of something of that attitude still. But the hatred that's expressed is revealed in the form of saying they're racist, they're backward, they're low intellect, all the things that people probably know about. But it's proving to be quite a problem. And you can see that there are people stepping into the breach to make sure that this kind of conflict doesn't develop much further. I would argue Grayson Perry is one of them. You know, and in what he's doing, he's trying to bridge that gap between, you know, the working people he visits in communities in the north and the metropolitan elite to which he's part of. But equally, Jeremy Corbyn is trying to bridge that gap, being a man of the people who will emote with them and find a way to kind of, you know, cure or institutionalize in some form, as the British establishment always have. Any radicals that have ever emerged, whether it be in the world of art or in the world of politics, have always been incorporated in some way into the system and made into something that don't go on to develop any pure attack or significant change to the nature of British society. If we don't recognize these things going on, we have no chance of defending Brexit and defending not just Brexit, but the concept of democracy, really. So what we're really saying is a huge proportion of British people have given up on the concept of democracy. And we have to, and that's reflected in the world of art just as much as any other sphere.
I'd like to come back into the panel to get some more responses from them. Oh, have we got one more person here? Yes. We'll take one more from the floor.
Okay, I'll try and be brief. Just thinking about the title, What Future for the Arts, and looking beyond Europe, and particularly the British Council's role, which has been the soft power kind of vehicle for culture and education across the world. So certainly, you know, Jeremy has worked internationally. Vicky used to work for the British Council. Stefano, European work, you know, you've been involved in Angola. What I worry about is this kind of, you know, when I do meet international artists, I meet a lot of international artists in what I do, there's a lot of talking to each other and a lot of wonderful cultural exchange and cross-cultural dialogue, transcultural dialogue, you name it. It's happening amongst artists, and the British Council certainly funds those kind of programs in a very healthy way. I'd love to go to Thailand for a month in a 5-star hotel, but you know, sadly I haven't. Funded by the British Council, and it does feel that no, well, you know, but you know, this sort of circular, insular dialogue that goes on in the creative and cultural sector. If that is the kind of soft power approach to looking beyond, looking to the world, you know, and Britain's role of looking beyond itself and creating those kind of transcultural dialogues. Is it just a circular process? What does it do in the end? And those, I suppose, are questions perhaps for Jeremy. You've travelled the world, Stefano and Vicky. Thank you.
And there's one more there, yeah.
I find the discussion an interesting one, but also kind of slightly strange in the sense that as an arts practitioner who's been involved in productions in the Catalonia region, primarily Barcelona, for about 20 years in live performance art, built with no support from public money from the UK or the EU, I kind of remain fairly optimistic about the potential of people to actually build relationships and endure without the kind of legal and financial scaffolding constructed by the Arts Council, the EU, the British Council, and other sections of those arts institutions. However, I cannot ignore the fact that when I went to the offices of a very well-known digital complex in the West Country and announced the fact that I was supporting the leave position, you could have heard a pin drop in the offices as people then, I could see their brains whirling, and then came back at me with a whole litany of reasons why, both financially and practically, and for even linguistic reasons, those institutions were important. And to take those away would make their lives 10 times different, 10 times more difficult, particularly those that work in the film and television sector. And I haven't heard much of a cogent kind of argument in terms of giving an indication of how those problems actually can be overcome practically. At a very high level, I think people have made the points about art as social policy, but there are some very pragmatic things we also have to get our teeth into if we're to actually give a vision of how we actually push things forward.
I'll take two more and then I will come back.
Yeah. It does seem to me that James's point about, I think you said the culturalization of politics is a really, really important point. And that does seem to me to be the big shift that's taken place, especially through the duration of this election period. Because I think when you think about, everybody's been using the British Council, so let's stick with that. But the whole idea of pursuit of soft power through art, I think is reliant on the fact that there's political objectives in the first place that you can then set, and art becomes politicized through that. And it seems to me that where we are with politics just now is almost the evaporation of political objectives, almost the evaporation of politics, in a sense, through this election. And what has really come to the fore is an expression of belief in the future according to your personal values and the values of those that you most associate with. And this, it seems to me to be a really big problem is that if politics is now going to take this cultural form, then how do artists have the ability to create good art? It seems to me that the only way that they can respond to that with any effect and impact is to go all out to reclaim the whole idea of artistic freedom. That seems to me to be the thing that's really got to come to the fore just now, because if biennales are throwing artists out because they've culturally appropriated other forms, or if theatres are stopping plays going ahead because they don't like the fact that actors aren't of the correct race or whatever, those sort of values, unless we strive for artistic freedom and reject that, then I think art it cannot exist as a vibrant force.
There's quite a lot of issues, I think. Is this working? Yeah, it is. There's quite a lot of issues, obviously, that came up, and I just wanted to share some of those. The first thing I think is that to bring it back to the central question of the democratic, the question for democracy, is if Brexit was a democratic turn, and I'm not sure it was, but that remains to be seen, then I think we can say that there is an opportunity here, I think, for the arts also to seize, for that also to be a democratic turn for the arts in the way that it is practiced and indeed administrated. But the question, I think, for the challenge, therefore, for the arts is can they measure up? Who is it for? These are questions which I think will emerge, or answers that will emerge. What I think is perhaps needed is to breach vested interests of the arts establishment, and I think that this is the opportunity which may present itself now when there's a crisis of confidence in the establishment, it seems to me, which they're very busily trying to mask. And I think that the help that in terms of thinking about how I might do this actually comes perhaps from Nietzsche. We've grown very used to an Apollonian idea of the arts as basically being curative and restorative. And I have always been much more excited myself about the idea of the arts as being, if you like, Dionysian, and that actually it is breakdown and it is collapse that is much more interesting than healing. In other words, it is the chase rather than the consoling ending that is what really makes a story, Parce Aristotle. But we must, so it must be more than simply maintaining a good opinion of ourselves and obliging the establishment with our conformist thinking and reproducing the very things that it wants to hear. And I would like to thank also Stefano, I think, for mentioning a crucial figure in this discussion, I think, which is Gilles Deleuze. The Society of the Spectacle, not Deleuze. It's Gilles... Guy Debord, not even Gilles anyone. Guy Debord. You made me think of him, and then I got all mixed up. But I think that Guy Debord is a good, useful person at this point, and I think that the art must do more than furnish a kind of public spectacle. And I think that in terms of what will actually happen, we have to accept that we don't know, and that's as it should be.
Let's come back. Anyone like to dive in first, and we'll work our way around. Okay, James, and then...
I really like the point was made at the back. I was always amazed when that whole discussion about Creative Britain was going on, at the misunderstandings, the many layers of misunderstandings that were going on, where people would confuse the question of arts policy and art, the practice of arts. And always confused because people don't really understand the proportions, the difference between how much art is like publicly funded and how much is privately funded. And it's massively in the favour of privately funded. I mean, there are lots of different kinds of subsidies, like art schools and universities and all the rest. But actually, it's a very robust time in creative industries. It's been very, very fruitful. The last 25 years, I think, have really, in terms of like money spent, let's say, and products made, it's way ahead. And artists, successful artists, a lot better off than they used to be. And the whole of like novel writing is a self-supporting industry. There are no subsidies for novel writing. Obviously, things like theatre and opera are limping along because it's quite difficult to do, and nobody wants to go to see them, it would seem. But I always never could understand why people got mixed up between what the Arts Council supports, which is, by and large, weird stuff that not many people like, otherwise they wouldn't be supporting it, and what is succeeds, which can tend to the middle brow, but basically it's pretty robust. I thought it's an interesting comparison, but I don't think it quite works, because actually, though I hated it at the time and was really angry with it and wrote lots of horrible things about it, Tony Blair's projection for the arts and Creative Britain was relatively successful. And I thought there was lots that was dishonest and untrue, but it did parcel up the thing. I see nothing like that at the moment. There's nobody's remotely interested. In fact, the only thing you see in the arts is people moaning about Brexit. I was talking with Manik about There's a great thing on the Guardian website you can see right now, which is these 5-minute plays that David Hare and other people have done about Brexit, and they're so weirdly awful that you think that they must be parodies. And I'm thinking, is this evil that David Hare is writes this kind of insane insult about people that voted to leave? And you're thinking, no, it's good fun. It's actually adding to the mix. It's all pretty good. So yeah, I think that's important to know that the arts will survive. There's no question that if no money was spent, no public subsidy was spent, that would be a disaster for lots of people. But arts would be robust in Britain. I don't think there's any reason why there should be less spending. In fact, people don't understand maths, it seems to me. Britain contributes more to the European Union than the European Union spends in Britain, in which case we ought to be, cash-wise, better off. Only looking at the budget, we ought to be better off. Now, you may say that at this moment, a wicked government might well cut subsidies to the arts instead of maintaining them. And that's an issue, probably, for a government, an elected government, to discuss and for people to debate. But there's no obvious reason why there should be less money for the arts. There ought, in principle, to be more money for the arts, setting aside the question of what it does to the economy. So I don't think that stands at all. There's a couple of other points I want to make, but I think I'll save them for now.
Yeah, okay, we'll come back to you. Vicky?
Yeah, I think this point about the sort of commercial sector and the arts outside of the official structures of public funding and so on is really true. And one of my last battles with the British Council before I left was over an exhibition of Thomas Heatherwick that was touring East Asia, which Alistair knows a lot about as well, both of us in battle over this one. But it was funded by something called the Great Britain Campaign, which was, a sort of a campaign run by the Foreign Office and by UK Trade and Industry. And the British Council, there was this huge tension between the British Council wanting to be funding initiatives that reflected values and policy and so on, and this, what was perceived as this rather kind of commercial thing, promoting the work of a brilliant designer, responding to huge interest in East Asia in the ambitious ideas of this designer, and there was this sort of a big tension there. But the fact is that there is a massive interest in the very best British culture, design and so on from museums and cultural organisations around the world. And it's that interest and the audiences that are there for good work that means that you will get touring productions and you will get exhibitions of artists overseas and British architects being commissioned to design opera houses and so on. It's the interest and actually the fact that those commissioning bodies don't necessarily have the hang-ups that the arts establishment has here about showcasing great work. And I think, interestingly, with the British Council as an example of, the arts establishment, the real fear I think they faced with Brexit was that the EU's top-down approach to funding, the thought of that crutch not being there, not determining how they would spend money and distribute money, and that crutch, that sort of substitute for all the other criteria that you might use to fund art, is a scary thing if you're in an organisation like that, because for so long they've been taking their lead from that sort of from that top-down approach, and I think essentially that's what we're battling against, isn't it? Is the sort of diktat of an organisation like that tells us how we should spend money. I mean, for me, there are lots of good things done by arts organisations, but the best is really when money is given on with very few conditions and strings attached to artists who can, and that can buy them the time and the space to pursue their own idea in the obsessive way that they need to, without having to respond to another agenda in that way.
Thanks. I wanted to respond to Manik's point, actually, which was about what do we do when we meet other artists or when we travel, and wouldn't it be nice everyone could go and stay in 5-star hotels. And it just kind of reminded me that I got a really good education and I had great teachers. I knew nothing, literally nothing about the British Empire until I think I was probably about 21. And this horrifies me. Truly, I find it kind of really monstrous and depressing that knowledge among people like myself of our cultural privilege could be that fleeting and it was kind of art school really where I sort of started to develop that, and I have travelled a lot. I spent a lot of time in the West Bank in Palestine, and reading The Guardian, you wouldn't understand. Picking up what you read in The Guardian today, you wouldn't know about the British Mandate. We've done a good job of erasing our colonial history over there. So I think I would foreground for my personal experience what's kind of most incredibly valuable about travel is to reiterate and remind artists from over here going over there, wherever there is, and most often it's like somewhere that our imperial tentacles have and continue to exploit, and to be able to be in a position where that information, which might not be so readily available to other 20-year-olds, other people who might have been in my position, can be transferred through the medium of art, which I think it's very good at. And I don't see so much post-colonial discourse pushed through other mediums like outside contemporary art. Unfortunately, I don't see it in Hollywood. I see, or other forms of cultural production. So that's one way I think that travel is desperately important, and freedom of movement should be really, really emphasized as a priority ongoing for artists.
I just basically would like to follow up on a few considerations about the art market, because just recently I started this new job in a commercial gallery, and I realized that the artwork supported by sponsorships is such like a tiny aspect of a market that is booming. And so in a way it is very important. Probably this could be like the next chapter of this type of conversation, is to investigate the interface between commercial world and non-commercial world, and how can we imagine like a future for non-profit and non-commercial activities. Definitely, I agree very much with what the professor was saying before. If we remove all the backing and all the support, public support to the art industry, the industry would still booming, because there are so many interests around it, and it would just definitely wouldn't feel any big discontent. On the contrary, large organizations, and that is actually what is happening now, large organizations, large galleries are going to substitute a state which is weaker and weaker. And this is something that is tangible in the south of Europe, where state does not have money to promote art, and the big galleries replace public funds. From the architectural point of view, it is very interesting that this is reflected into the typology of the galleries. I don't want to give names, but when you look, for example, at some very large galleries in the south of London or in Mayfair, even more in the States, they are like almost museums. They are far too big to be galleries, and they are not quite museums yet. And I think that these architectural typologies really explains a lot of what is going on now. And this explains even why on the other side, museums must rely on the private money in order to make their program happen, because otherwise they couldn't. So there is like a very complex conundrum between public and private, and to imagine that there is like a pure side of it that can sustain itself with its own means is a pretty utopic at the moment. It's really a muddy water.
I just wanted to come back on, because a few people raised the question of the international art scene. And Jeremy, you talked about the your lack of knowledge in terms of your own education about the British Empire and so on. I just wanted to actually just challenge that slightly in terms of the arts, because the whole certainly the Creative Europe agenda, which is the sort of funded international arts partnerships, does actually, apart from creating a sort of almost separate international sphere, which sometimes sort of goes into partnership or engages with local communities, but nevertheless is somehow separate, it has, to me, seemed to look very closely at the sort of troubled past, Europe's troubled past. And in a way, and not just Europe, but, in other words, there seems to be a great emphasis on the almost reinventing Europe through the arts by confronting the really difficult histories. And I'm not sure how well it's done it. It's sort of almost produced a kind of an official version of the bad old days of empire, which maybe connects to this idea of the sort of the art as a sort of soft power, where difficult relationships are kind of renegotiated and reformed through culture and the arts. So in terms of there seemed to me to have been a great emphasis on looking at the troubled past in the arts, but I don't know if it's been very much of a sort of free or open or truthful discussion. It seems that the agenda often is set that we will confront this and we will heal this and we will come to terms with the past, and that seems to be very powerful, certainly in this sort of European art scene. Have you come across that?
I completely agree that, yeah, it's very present in contemporary art, and I think that's great, which is why we have to protect it, because I don't think it's about healing the past so much as confronting our contemporary. We still live through the spoils of those wars and those forms of exploitation. I think are very, very present indeed. So I think it's just a debate that needs to be urgently kept alive, and to reflect how it's perpetuated into the present. I guess to sort of pick up on public-private funding, and I really like the point you were making about these architectural typologies and how they respond. That so resonates, and it's kind of really acute observation. Art. I think as artists we sort of need to really examine and investigate ways of resisting spectacle, of not being wholly subsumed, and I worry about the idea that art could just be privately funded, and then we'd just lose a bit of the weird stuff, which you were pointing out. I think that's good to raise the contention. But I mean, whose weird stuff are we losing? What is the weird stuff that gets privileged out as the market decides what is important? Perhaps someone like me would fare okay. Because I have been schooled in the sort of visual language of the sort of dominant discourse. I think what we'd lose is an enormous amount of voices that are privileged out of that discourse, and so the market wouldn't give too much of a shit about that. So I think it's really defending less heard and more invisible areas of cultural production that public funding urgently needs to support.
I'm going to maybe two more contributions from the floor and keep them very short, and that will give you 1.5 minutes each to sort of come in with closing comments. Oh, sorry, can't hear me. Sorry, that's wasted a minute. So we've got, from the floor, maybe two more, because we're really short of time, and that will give the speakers 1.5 minutes each, which is not very long, for them to kind of give their closing comments. So everyone's putting their hand up. Can you be the quicker you are, the more I'll get. So take it and speak. Yeah, speak.
Okay. It's just a question, I suppose, which has been preying on my mind through the discussion. There was a big discussion about the arts, or move for the arts in relation to community projects. And then I think what's happened through Brexit, which has been the plugs pulled out, is that many of those things have collapsed, or the sense that the arts connect to the community has collapsed. So I think, has that got any future? Is that a good thing? And then I think the other thing is that there's one of the reactions that I think has happened has been an absolute censorious climate around people and what people are allowed to say. So I agree that Brexit caused an earthquake, and then what seems to have happened is that many people I've spoken to, ordinary people, are frightened to speak because they're afraid of being called racists. And that's one thing. So that conversation seems to have closed down. And at the same time, in the arts world, another conversation, similar type of conversation, is closed down through the discussion of cultural appropriation. And I think there is a kind of relationship between those two discussions, which I can't quite work out. Help.
Well, I agree with Vicky and James's assessment. I think so that James, Brexit is on a knife edge, and I think there's every danger that we will leave the EU in name only. But Vicky, I think everything has changed. But my concern is that what we'll end up with is a shabby compromise that won't be a kind of a collision of ideas that I think you'd like to see, Jeremy, but will be a kind of a polite way to avoid the issue. And I think the result of that will be cynicism, and so all of the good things that could have come out of that collision of ideas will be dissipated, and we'll just have a kind of cynical reflection on it instead.
Was there one other hand up there? Was it someone? Yeah. Very quickly, did you? Yeah.
Just going back to the beginning where Jeremy was mentioning the sort of the conversation, the debate, everyone really talking, and then versus the private business of the arts working, and then and just basically this thing of what about citizens, talking about colonial history and our ignorance on all of these things. We're not actually taught about what being a citizen is anyway, and that maybe that can connect, all the different types of artists to the arts and the private world, if that makes sense, trying to describe it.
Yeah, thanks, great. Well, thank you for that. And I'll come back and maybe just go in reverse order. Vicky, do you want to start, and I'll work my way back?
Somebody talked about the role that public figures have, such as Corbyn and others, have played in trying to reconnect with communities. And this general awareness within the establishment of that they are living in the bubble, the echo chamber that people talk about. And I just wanted to mention how I think that there's a danger that although it's good that there's a sort of wake up to what's going on, there's a danger that this is interpreted and it plays through as simply kind of reinforcing a top-down agenda in a way, because I think you can see with something like the Arts Council their interpretation of the situation is that is to say, right, 80% of our funding is now going to go outside of London. So what you have, that's kind of one example. I think they even decided that before Brexit, but the trajectory is accelerated towards saying we're going to make decisions about funding not based on the quality of the artwork or the proposal that the artist is putting forward, but on a political priority, which is that we must connect with disenfranchised communities. And so I think that the net result is a sort of reinforcing of a sort of top-down, policy-driven arts strategy, which is I think the last thing that should be happening. I think the question of speaking the truth in the arts is really important, and it's one of the reasons that I value art, is that it does speak a truth, and it can cut through the sort of blather that's spoken by lots of people, like I heard this morning at the speeches at the Serpentine Pavilion, the platitudes and the dishonesty, and the use of this sort of use of language, innovation, creativity, healing, community. It's endless, and it's particularly bad within the arts. It really is, and I think we need to be a lot more honest and in saying, when the arts establishment talks about the radical nature of the arts and its maverick character and so on, I think we should be saying, well, the really maverick thing that's happened is that the population rejected an institution, the EU, telling us, determining our future, and that. I think we sort of need to re-look at or remind people of what it means to be radical and maverick, and that all the talk about disruption, which everybody in design and maybe in the art world as well loves to talk about disruption and disruptive creativity. This is just a platitude. When you look at what people did last year, that was a really disruptive, radical thing, and I think that's what we need to remind everybody of that, maybe.
Thanks very much, Becky. Stefano.
Yeah, I think that I really find this final comment very refreshing, and I totally agree with Vicky.
That's
yes.
good for time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, me too, I think. Yeah, really. Yeah, thanks. I mean,
do you want to come back?
Yeah.
We'll
James.
give you more, James, do you want to come back on something, and then we'll come back to you back at the last word.
Yeah.
It's a very clever strategy.
I think one of the really intriguing things about the way artists, writers and playwrights and artists have responded to the Brexit is a kind of blinking incomprehension, which I've enjoyed, not out of rudeness, because I think that's right. I think all of us actually felt a kind of a blinking incomprehension that following morning, because what was so amazing was that people who have been bypassed, people whose voices haven't been heard, found a way of registering their point. And I think that's the dramatic thing. There is a reason why artists feel that, especially. There is something about the arts which is peculiarly alienated from its public. And it's kind of a guilty secret, really, isn't it? Is that the arts attending public is a tiny minority of the general public. The general public mostly like crass mass civilization, and it's a very small group of people that are into difficult art. John Carey even goes so far as to say that's what modernism is. It's a kind of exclusion technique to keep the public out, which I think is a bit unfair, but you kind of see what he means. Is there is something very cloistered and protective about our very dramatically insular and ahead and vanguard space that is just too good for the people. And I think what I like about the Brexit is that it's a bit like that moment when when you get a kick up the arse in the Fred Garneau film, and I think we all should enjoy a good kick up the arse, because we've been told, haven't we? We've been told that there's more. There are more people here than have been heard, and I think that no matter what happens in Europe, which was it ever about international negotiations? It was surely about people imposing themselves upon the present.
Okay, I do have a final comment, which is just to given that Stefano, with your history, you've clearly thought about this. With the all-consuming subsumption of everything into capital and spectacle, that we need to really remind ourselves as artists, art practitioners, that really the struggle is on the symbolic order. It's on that level of exchange of symbols, and that we really wield power at that point. Brexit is a portmanteau in linguistic terms. And it's quite an interesting object as a word, which is a sort of verbal noun kind of construction. And it was introduced in 2012 by this guy, Peter Wilding, who worked for a think tank called British Influence, who unfortunately were campaigning for Remain, and so sort of unwittingly ushered in this kind of linguistic object that operated in reverse. And interestingly, just to consider how at its advent, it was always used in scare quotes, Brexit. And just to consider how time moves forward, and by 2013, 2014, it lost the scare quotes. It had become something like a reality. And there are currently 18 trademark applications for Brexit blue cheese, Brexit biscuits, Brexit energy drinks, Brexit bread. And I think as artists, we can adopt the same strategy and introduce scary ideas that may then become subsumed and become trademarked into the cultural mainstream.